Okay, so we are talking about Parashat Bahar this morning, Leviticus 25, 1 through 26, 2. And just for my benefit, I'm going to pray before we start. So, God, we just thank you for this opportunity to be here together. We ask you to open our eyes to the wonders of your word. We ask you for the spirit of wisdom and revelation. And we just say that we love you, Yeshua. Amen.
Amen.
So Bahar in Hebrew is on the mount, implied as Sinai. And this is a significant encounter with the Lord. We're going to talk about what the themes actually are, but I just want to remind us, he is still teaching the Israelites who he is and therefore who they are, and how to be in covenant with him. And because of that, I think there are lots of reminders as he's giving the commands. I am Adonai. And I think sometimes those appear to me as explanations or reasons God is giving for the commands because I'm Adonai. And this portion is about the Israelites' relationship with the land and with each other, which reflects their relationship with God. So we do things because of who he is. We are to be good stewards of land and people because they all belong to him. How I treat my neighbor is a reflection that that person belongs to the Lord, and I'm supposed to steward them like they belong to the Lord. God is the landlord and we're the tenants, or the Israelites are the tenants. One of the applications is, and we can talk about this later, are we being faithful stewards of God's land and people? So Leviticus, which I'm going to mispronounce, Vayikra,
yeah.
is and he called. I love the Hebrew name of Leviticus, the Hebrew translation of Leviticus, and he called. So I always like to start with the overview, just so we remember kind of where we are in the story and the big picture of things. So we're at the end of the third book of the Torah. We have one more portion left. We're almost done. And so in Exodus, the Israelites exit from slavery. God enters into a covenant relationship with them in the desert, and they quickly break the covenant and rebel. And God wants his presence to go with them. But we have this problem of how do an unholy people not just approach a holy God, but live in covenant, be in an intimate relationship with a holy God. And so this is why we love Leviticus, because God makes a way. God says, I have an answer to that problem. And we see this problem reflected in the first verse of Leviticus when we started this book. That God is in the tent of meeting and he calls to Moses from the tent of meeting. So Moses is not in the tent with him. And then by the end of the book, we're going to see two portions from now that at the beginning of Numbers, Leviticus works. Moses is in the tent meeting with God in the beginning, in the first verse of the first portion of Numbers. So this section of, if you break Leviticus into, I realize not everybody has been here, so I'm glad I brought a visual. This is from, Emma's passed this out before, and this is from Who Shall Ascend the Hill of the Lord, right? And so this portion on here is labeled sanctuary laws. I also, if we're breaking it into 7 portions with the Day of Atonement being the apex, I also like the this section, the categorization of rituals, because this section deals with holy days and feasts and celebrations, and a recurring theme in the rituals is retelling the story of God, how he rescues the Israelites and sets them apart from the nations. And so this is just totally my opinion that I thought of while I was studying this week. I think that I am Adonai in some ways becomes short code in this portion for I am the Lord your God who saved you out of slavery, who brought you forth from Egypt with a mighty right hand. Just kind of the same way, Hear, O Israel is short code for the Shema. Like if you say that to any practicing Jew, like they know what you mean is the rest of the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. And the rest of those verses. So I think just if we look at it, when he says, I am Adonai, he's reminding them who he is, what he's done from that. He's not just saying, I'm God. There's like a deeper, longer meaning there. We're a little group this morning, but feel free to interrupt me at any time with something you want to say or questions, and Emma can interrupt and correct me at any time if I say something too heretical.
Oh gosh.
Okay, so we're going to get to the real theme of this now that we know where we are in the story of the Shabbat year, or the Shemitah. And I think something that stood out to me this time when I was reading it is that it's a Shabbat rest. Like it says specifically for the land. So one of the questions I have is, why does the land need a Shabbat? Does anybody have any thoughts about that? Good morning.
To make it the best it can be, I think, because it replenishes the nutrients, allows it to, we know that it can cultivate itself.
Yes.
If we're always doing something to it.
Totally.
Yeah. So it's good for the land.
It's good for the land, yeah. And good for the product that's going to come out of the land in the not Shabbat years,
and
right?
it's good for us.
It's good for us. Any other thoughts about why the land might need rest? I'm not saying I have an answer, just asking the question.
It reflects the pattern of Shabbat that God, commanded and illustrated in the creation.
Absolutely.
So it's like, and the people were tied to the land, and God gave it to them, and so there's this interrelationship between the people and God and the land.
Absolutely. So it's a part of God's natural cycle, doing things with cycles of rest and restoration. And also, like, if the land, I think the point you're making, if the land needs a rest, then the people are forced to rest too, right?
Yeah, it's all together.
So it's all interconnected.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I also think it's interesting that this, in verse 4, it says a Shabbat for Adonai. And I don't know if that's just like emphasis, or I just kind of thought about and was asking the Lord, like, why say there a Shabbat for Adonai versus other people that just, the other verses that just says a Shabbat. So in the Shabbat year, you can't even reap what grows by itself, nor gather grapes unattended on the vines. It does say, however, that those things can be food for yourself, your servants, your worker, your outsider, animals. So I want to pose a question, like, what's the difference? What's the distinction between when God says you can't sow and prune, you can't reap and harvest, but you can provide for yourself from what grows naturally? What's the difference between those two things? And one of the reasons I'm asking that question is because then how can we extrapolate how that would apply to us? Because when I read it the first time, it was like, that kind of seems, let me go to that verse. I don't think I wrote it down, but it should be right here in like 5 or 6. You are not to reap what grows by itself during the harvest, nor gather the grapes of your untended vine. So that seems like, leave that food alone that grew on its own, right? And then the next sentence is, it is to be, I'm skipping down to 6. Whatever the Shabbat of the land produces will be food for yourself, for your servant, your maidservant, your hired worker, and the outsider dwelling among you. Even the animals and of your livestock and the animals that are in your land. So those two sentences are not contradictory. What's the distinction that the Lord's making that there? Yeah.
Actually, I'm not sure if I'm answering, but I feel like it's about trusting the Lord.
It absolutely is.
It's about, he's a provider.
That's
and,
like the next section of my note. He's teaching them. No, that's fine. That's great that you're pulling it out.
And someone said this, like the Lord told someone, if you put your hands to it, my hand's behind my back. But if you trust me and put your hand behind your back, then I'll put my hand in it. Yeah. And I remember this one time where God told me to quit everything and seek him, get oil. You know, I heard a message about the foolish virgins put ministry ahead of intimacy. The Lord told me to quit my youth pastoring and my staffing at IHAM several years ago, and then to seek His face and all. And I thought, wow, I didn't want to quit youth pastoring because finances were helping to pay for the house mortgage and all. And then I had my identity in my ministry at IHOP. But when I did that, more money came in. As I was resting in the Lord, more money came in than, when I was working. So I really felt like the Lord saying, your work is not the provision.
Yeah.
I am. Do it my way and rest, and especially seek relationship with Him. When we sow into His heart, then His hand follow it.
Yeah. So that's definitely part of what's going on here. The Lord is definitely teaching them to rely on Him for provision. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. I think also, definitely the difference is they're not to sow a harvest for sure. And because you don't sow grapes, they just come up naturally. He's saying, don't reap that harvest. But he's not saying you can't use what comes up naturally. He's saying what comes up naturally, you can. But we'll get to it later. He's also going to provide enough food in the 6th year, right, to cover the 7th and the 50th year.
Can I add something?
Yes, please do.
I think another piece of it too is about income. It's about you don't harvest it to sell it. You can harvest it to provide for your own family, but it's you don't make profit off of Shabbat.
Yes.
Right?
I was having
Yes.
that same thought.
Yeah.
And that becomes a distinction in the 50th year
Yes.
that you're not supposed to make profit that year is definitely pulled out there.
Yeah.
And I was trying to study, I couldn't find anything, but I was trying to study does that mean you can't take it in all at once? And I don't think so, because that's the moment you're supposed to gather it,
Yeah.
but you're not supposed to sell it
Yeah.
for sure is the distinction.
Yeah. It's not providing your income, it's just feeding your family and your
And
servants, your
household,
livestock, all those things. And the other thing I just thought of was just the connection to which I think it was not in last week's, I think it was maybe 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago, of the instructions to not reap the corners of the field, to let those coming kind of traveling through have something. So it's those people are still provided for too.
Yes.
So it's the land is still providing and sustaining people in some sense, but it's not but it is it's in a different way.
Yes.
But it's but it's cool to see how all those different things actually connect together with what you're saying is they're not contradictory.
No.
It's just, it's a different year, but everything is still provided for.
Yes. Yeah, and it causes us to what I like to refer to as build different muscles of trust, because it's one thing to trust the Lord for the harvest on a normal year, which is real. The Lord's the one who sends the rain and the sun and protects us from natural disasters and makes sure that we have enough. And then it's a different thing to trust Him during a Shabbat year, and then it's a whole different thing to trust Him another year after that for the Jubilee year. So that was my next point. So good job, John, bringing that out. Adonai is teaching them to rely on Him for His provision. And I wanted to pull out this verse in verse 7. It's that at the end of it that says, all of its increase will be enough food. And so I want to ask you the question, what does enough mean? Do we have any thoughts about that? What does enough mean?
Feasting or fasting. Maybe,
Okay, say more about that. It
maybe-
could
or
be
may-
either, is
maybe,
what you're saying?
Yeah. You maybe don't need so much.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else thoughts on what enough means here?
It makes me think of the manna in the wilderness.
Yeah.
They have enough, which is where they're living while they're being given this
Yes.
instruction that will ultimately come into play in the land.
Mm-hmm.
But they are currently in a where they're provided just enough. They can't keep it overnight. It spoils if they gather too much. All that. So it's interesting that it's
Yes. Yeah.
they're learning what enough is actively as they're hearing this.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, I think the difference is need versus greed.
Need versus
Or
greed.
need
Okay.
versus, want.
Yes.
Instead of what we want, what we need.
Yeah. So, and I used to work for Compassion International a number of years ago at their headquarters in Colorado, and I liked one of their slogans was the opposite of poverty is not wealth, it's enough. And this definitely made me think of, like, I don't think this is just a philosophical question. It made me think of Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. That doesn't mean I don't want anything. I get every single thing that I ever wanted. It means that what the Lord provides for me is enough. And so for me, I think this is actually a really important spiritual question, not just a philosophical one. What is enough? How do I decide what's enough for me and how much I give? Etc. And you also, it does not say this in this portion, but in Deuteronomy 15:2, it points out that we don't collect debts in a Shabbat year. So once again, we're not making money, we're not getting a profit in a Shabbat year. Okay, so I'm going to move on to Jubilee, or Yovel in Hebrew. Everything that I looked at said that it's probably not ever observed. I mean, that's correct.
Yeah, that's generally what I've always seen, is that we don't really have a record of
it.
full observation, at
Yeah.
least, of it. They may have done parts of it, but probably not to the fullness.
Yes, and so I just want to throw that out there. Like, why do you think this might not have ever been fully observed by the Israelites?
Lack of trust.
A lack of trust in the Lord could be. I don't really have an answer. It's a good question to ask.
Do you mean like the not fully observed, like the returning of the land? I mean, all the details.
Yeah.
Was never fully.
Yeah, like letting the land rest for that long, and yeah, the land going back and debts being forgiven and all of those things.
Right.
There were probably some who did some of those things, but as a nation, we don't really have much record of the nation as a whole doing it to the as God instructed it.
It also seems like it would have been a significant thing enough that, like, if it was really done, it would have been reported.
Right.
We don't really know,
Yeah.
but
Right.
Big deal.
yeah, it's a big deal.
Yeah, two things. One is because they didn't keep it right for like 490 years, they were in exile for 70 years, right? So Shemitah is really a big thing to the Lord, you know. And I heard that these Orthodox Jews in Israel, they try to keep the Shemitah by, I don't know, going to harvest something, you know, before the Shemitah year. And so they went to a strip near Gaza and harvested before. And when they did that, they didn't realize it, but there was a terror tunnel. And these terrorists that came out, they thought we're expecting all this wheat field and all, but there was no. And then they got, you know, they neutralized them and all. But anyhow, by observing the Shemitah, there was protection in that land.
Okay. So the 50th year of Jubilee is the return of to return to your own property, return to your family. For me, I feel like this echoes the covenants, like it's land and seed. Go back to your family, go back to your land. This is the second Shabbat year in a row, so we've already talked about this, but once again, relying on the Lord's provision. This is a big deal for 2 years in a row because it basically means you have to wait until the third harvest. It's a long time. But I love in verse 21, he says, now I will command my blessing on you. So like when the Lord commands his blessing, it goes, right? And I think that also like it occurs to me that this requires discipline and stewardship on our part to like steward the harvest from the 6th year correctly. Like if we sell it all or if we eat too much of it, then we're not going to have to last us. And it requires wisdom, right? It doesn't mean that we're supposed to live in poverty those 2 years. Like the Lord says he's going to provide, he's going to command his blessing. But it requires a partnership from us to steward what the Lord has given us. And we talked about you don't collect any debts on a Shabbat year, and you obviously don't in a Jubilee year because you've forgiven them all the year before, so you shouldn't have any debts from Israelites. It does say you're still allowed, so you don't have to release foreigners from debts. Hi, good morning. So there in verse 18, we see an admonition to not cheat one another, but to fear God. Once again, just a reminder that the Lord's still teaching the Israelites who he is and therefore who they are and how they're supposed to live in covenant with him. You're supposed to keep his ordinances and carry them out so that you can live in the land. In verse 23, he says, do not sell the land permanently. Why are they not supposed to sell the land permanently?
Ultimately, but
What's that?
it's his.
It's his. I mean, he says that specifically. It belongs to me.
Yeah.
So he says in verse 23 too, because the land is mine. And this, reminds me of Psalm 1, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. And so everything belongs to the Lord. The land, the people in it, which is why we've already talked about, like, we don't just steward the land, we steward our relationship with our neighbor, and they're a gift from the Lord that we're to steward too. Everything belongs to the Lord. And it's like a real obligation that we have. In verse 29, within a walled city, there's the right of redemption for 1 year. Any ideas why it's different in a walled city than the other lands that we are obligated to give back? Once again, I don't necessarily have a good answer. I'm just asking the question. In verse 32, we see the Levites always have a permanent right of redemption. Their fields cannot be sold. They're permanently theirs. And then I want to talk a bit about the commands starting in verse 35 about how we're to treat our brother. And I'm going to talk about who is our brother, especially for us. I want to ask some questions about that. But verse 35 says, if your brother becomes poor and can't support himself, you're to uphold him. So let him live with you. Don't charge him excessive interest on things. Don't lend money at an interest. Don't charge for food at a profit, which I was looking through this. I was like, does that mean you can technically charge them for food as long as you don't make a profit? I don't think that's I think maybe you technically could. I don't think that's the insinuation that you should do that here. And once again, there's an explanation of why. I am Adonai, your God, who brought you forth out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God, he says in verse 38. And then in verse 39, it says, if your brother sells himself to you, he can't be a slave. You can't treat him you can treat him as a hired hand or a temporary resident. You're not to sell him as a slave, and it's only to be until the Jubilee year. It's not supposed to be permanent or forever. Foreigners can be permanent slaves, inherited permanently, but it specifically, there's a command to not rule over your brother with harshness. One of the commentaries I looked up said, don't be a pharaoh to your own family, which I thought was an interesting way to translate that. So brother is the most common word. I think once in this portion it says B'nai Yisrael. And so the question is, who is their brother? When God speaks to them, yes.
So everybody in the nation is descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes.
And they're all it's all supposed to be family, which is interesting. The idea behind like where you were going earlier with the whole Jubilee and how we're supposed to treat each other. If you think about this is contrary to fallen human nature and completely contrary to what was going on in the nations and in the world around them.
Yes.
It took a tremendous amount of integrity on everyone, not only the person who was lending and who was helping their brother, but the person who was, how did they get poor in the first place? Okay, and you're trusting this person or you're taking this person into your home, you brought up the charging for food. Right?
Yes.
So think about that. So then your expectation would be that this person is still working hard, still trying to earn their keep, like we like to say, right? And so it takes a tremendous amount of integrity on everybody's part, which was probably, I think John said about not trusting. Like that has a lot to do with how we are as people towards each other.
Yes.
Like, is this person really going to do the right thing on both sides of it? Like, is this person borrowing knowing that they're not going to have to repay or it's going to end up? And is this person lending to make more of a profit from it than they're supposed to, and the fact that this is family. Like if you have brothers or sisters right now, right, or a direct family right now, and your brother is in need or your sister is in need or somebody in your direct family is in need, like what's your heart towards them in regards to this?
Yes.
This is supposed to be on a national level, really hard. Like,
when you have that big of a family, you might not know that person over there from another tribe who comes to you and says, I need a place to live, I need food, right?
yeah. So I mean, again, this is the times as I've read through this, I'm like, oh, it seems like it's pretty straightforward. The commandments are pretty straightforward, but this one, out of all of them, requires a huge amount of integrity on everybody, and is contrary to human nature, fallen human nature, to be this way.
Absolutely. So once again, the Lord's treating us to trust Him, because if we trust Him, we do His command. We it helps us trust in other, like we have to put trust in other people, but we're ultimately putting it in the Lord, that He's going to steward that relationship and help us.
Well,
And
Scripture says when you give to the poor, you're giving to me.
exactly.
You're loaning to God.
Yes.
So, but again, real easy to say that.
Yeah.
Not so easy to do it.
And when you were talking, it made me think about, like, I wonder if there was a temptation to be like stingier as it gets close to Jubilee year, because I know that debt probably isn't going to get repaid. You know, it's 3 years before Jubilee debt. If I lend someone a lot of money, I know that I may not get it back. And when you're talking about, like, if we had really, really healthy dynamics, right, like that were reflecting God's heavenly design, if my literal brother comes to me and says something went wrong, I need a place to live, I need food, I say, of course. Like, you come stay with me. You can have a really nice room in my house. You can eat from my table. Like, even if I don't have a lot, I'm going to help you get on your feet and financially until you can make it on your own again. And so we're supposed to do that for the whole nation. That's a big deal. And I think there are also some other, like, there's not supposed to be, we're going to talk about this in a minute, there's not supposed to really be poverty within Israel, and there are other safeguards in place for that too. So Jubilee is like the last, like, resort of that.
So do you think, this just popped into my head while you were talking about that. It's like, because of what you're saying of, like, there's supposed to be, I like how you said that, it's kind of safeguards against poverty in general. So if someone does find themselves in that situation, they've probably made some pretty poor decisions.
Probably. Or had some really bad things happen to them, one or the other.
So it's almost like some of these things should be like, in the event where the person has made really bad decisions, it's like seeing this mercy, basically, hopefully would draw you back into community, into the Lord, and to making better decisions. And if bad things happen to you, again, it's like this mercy of, like, you're not gonna get just, it's not like, sorry, see you later, you're on your own. You know, it's like, it's an extension of the mercy of the Lord.
Yes. And as you're saying that, I'm thinking, like, what kind of confidence should that build in us, that, like, no matter what happens, like, we are gonna do our best, but no matter what happens, like, our family's always going to take us back. The Lord's always going to have mercy on us and help us again, right?
I think the whole idea of inheritance here, I mean, when you're looking at the Jubilee laws in their entirety, I see, an echo of the idea of inheritance under the new covenant. That we have something that is irrefutably given to us by God. Right? And regardless of whether it's something bad that has happened to us or stupid things that we do, that inheritance has a safeguard that is sure, that it's not something that is up to us. It's something given, it's grace. It's given to us.
Yeah.
So there is grace here illustrated. There's a lot of stuff that's foreshadowed here.
Yeah.
And might I say, when I think of this, my mind immediately goes to Isaiah 61. 4. And when you guys were saying at the very beginning that we don't know for sure whether Israel ever fully kept this. That in and of itself is an illustration of a very profound theological truth, that the law was given to teach us, to bring us to Messiah, right? And Jesus gets up and says, I am here fulfilling Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to declare liberty. And the acceptable year of the Lord, this day is this fulfilled in your ears. In other words, he fulfills what Israel could never do. Right? And it's all God's grace.
Yes.
It's a beautiful thing.
I'm going to come to you in a second. Let's just go there for a second, though, because that's actually Jesus reading us scroll is the Haftorah, or the New Covenant portion for this week. Like, he is declaring that this is a Jubilee year, right? When he says this is the year of the Lord's favor, I think the insinuation is that he's declaring this is a Jubilee year. We're setting the captives free. We're proclaiming liberty. We're proclaiming good news to the poor. So Shabbat provides rest, Jubilee provides return, and I was like asking the Lord, okay, there's an equation there. What does rest plus return equal? It's Yeshua. Like he's the one that brings both of those things together. He also, I'm like jumping ahead, but he is our kinsman redeemer. Like he is the one. To me, it makes so much more sense, the language of like he purchased us when you do it through the lens of this portion, that like he's to buy us back. What were you going to say?
Oh, well, finish.
No, it's fine. It's fine. We're just
Okay. Well, I came in late, so
just getting excited and jumping all over the place.
it might have been said. I was just going to pair what Kenny said, just the words of Yeshua. Whatever you do to the least of my brothers, that you do unto me.
Absolutely.
And then when this gentleman was speaking, just the whole, the commandment, when you come into the land and you're living in these houses, I can't quote it exactly, and everything is great, basically, don't forget,
Yes.
where it came from.
Yeah.
And don't forget the other thing, everything is, the Babylon.
And don't forget that you were slaves,
Right.
and I brought you out of that,
Right.
and you're not supposed to be a pharaoh to your brothers.
Right.
Yeah, that's what I was noticing too. Is like there's very kind of strategically in here, like I am the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, meaning don't forget that you're in Egypt. And even going back to like the provision, like God's blessing on the 6th year harvest to last, like that immediately makes me think back to, well, what's another time when the Lord, gave wisdom about saving a harvest with Joseph, and like save the world basically.
Yeah.
So it's like that's one of the things I like, that I think is really kind of the Lord too, is like he's giving them in this instruction while they actually have the knowledge to know that he can do these things. Like they've seen him do similar things. They've seen him send Joseph to Egypt seemingly to his death, but then he saves the world basically because he gets these dreams and he's put in this position of power and all these things. So of course he can make a harvest last for 3 years.
Yes.
Right? If you steward it well, if you listen to what he's saying and all these things.
And that's why he keeps reminding us, I am Adonai, I am Adonai.
Right.
Because, and like, I just kept thinking about like our human nature and how much we need to be reminded. Like, I need to be reminded who he is and what he's done for me and what he's done historically. So much. It's so easy to forget.
I feel like part of it is, he's showing his mercy and grace to us. From 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 9. For you know the grace of our Lord Yeshua HaMashiach, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, that you through his poverty might become rich. What an amazing exchange at the cross.
Mm-hmm.
And quick story, in Korea, there was this one North Korean general that told this one soldier to kill a Christian man. This soldier went, and then this guy was a Christian man, was a leader of a orphanage, and he thought, I can't kill him, but I have to obey. So he killed his son instead. And this guy got caught. He was put in court. He was sentenced to death, but that Christian man was there, and he says, no, Your Honor, don't kill him. I'll adopt him. Isn't that incredible? That even though this guy killed his son, Instead of just forgiving him, he adopts him into his family. And isn't that the gospel? And so I believe that's the ultimate truth.
Yeah. Okay, so we were talking about who is their brother, and I think one of the questions I want to ask us, if we have time for more discussion at the end, is like, what's the application for us? Who is our brother? And like, is it believers? Is it believers and Jews? Is it like, who's our neighbor? Is always a big question when Jesus says to treat people like they're our neighbor. So who, you can say, like, basically, I would just want to say that the Torah concept of moral responsibility and charity starts with us, those closest to us, but it also should extend outside of that eventually. But how far and in what ways, I think, is always a debate. Okay, so I want to talk about Dror, probably saying that wrong, release from economic servitude in the Jubilee year. So the Torah is abolishing economic oppression or continual poverty for the people, basically, through Jubilee year. And this is like God's system to keep us from a system where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And I kind of mentioned there's like some safeguards. I think there's like a natural system of family support, personal success, and then like the Jubilee year is kind of the last fallback when things go wrong, when things go terribly wrong, or like we have said, if people are irresponsible or make mistakes. And then when we jump down to verse 25, this is the first appearance of the term kinsman redeemer in the Torah or all of the scripture. So I went back and read Ruth this week because I love Ruth and I wanted to just remember that story correctly, where we see kinsman redeemer for, I believe, the second time, but I didn't research that. And that is supposed to be a foreshadowing, which we've already gone there, of who Yeshua is as our ultimate kinsman redeemer. So I love that phrase is used in this portion. And we've already talked about Luke 4:16-21, where Jesus gets up, he reads the scroll from Isaiah 61, 1-2, and that he's talking about the year of the Lord's favor, or a Jubilee year. I'm going to skip down to chapter 26, verses 1 and 2, just really briefly. Don't make idols, I am Adonai. Keep my commands in Shabbat. Have reverence for my sanctuary, I am Adonai. But I really I have like a couple more things I could say, but I want us to have time for more discussion to talk about, like, what do we think is the application for us in our lives now of a Shabbat year or a Jubilee year? Because some of us, like, just in the society that we live in, how do we practice these or bring these into our lives? Or even just what's the application for us, maybe is a better way to say that. I've done some research and I've never found a really good answer trying to figure out, like, do we know actually when, like, Shabbat year would fall now? Like, yeah. No, I can't find any definitive.
No, it's interesting because, of course, one of the things that we know about the calendar is that there's a lot of disagreement.
Yes.
Because I remember several years ago, it was like different people, depending on what calendar you look up or what site you look up, it was a Jubilee year for like 3 years in a row.
Yeah.
I'm like,
yeah.
I thought we just did that. So we don't have an accurate calendar.
Yeah.
But I like the question that you're posing about the principles of it.
Yes.
Because for us right now, not that God's calendar doesn't matter and the years don't matter, but the reality is that we don't know. So getting hung up on what year is right is not going to be helpful for us. So what the question that you're posing of, like, how does the concept apply?
Yes.
Is
and
a good
not
one.
knowing what year makes it hard, because like, this is supposed to be a community thing. Like, you can't really, just like the Torah, I can't keep Jubilee year totally by myself. Like, that doesn't, I mean, I can try to apply it to my life, but I'm not capable of keeping this command by myself. So does anybody have any thoughts about, like, how this applies for our lives now?
Well, I think, first of all, it represents God's ideal for society in his heart. right? So there's God's ideal is that there should be mercy in society, and I think that when I think of like New Covenant, I think of the Book of Acts in the early church and how that they lived some of this out when they cared for everybody, right? You know, in the early church in the Book of Acts, the Holy Spirit led them to do that. It wasn't they were just looking at a command, is it the right year? They weren't thinking that. It was the heart, the spirit of it that was being lived out there.
Yeah.
And especially within the body of Messiah, that is not often enough taken into account.
Yeah. So extrapolate that out. You're saying like we're supposed to live. This is the ideal. Mercy picked out.
It reflects God's heart
Okay.
for society.
Yeah.
And how society, we should not just disregard one another, but take care of one another, especially in the household
Yes.
of faith.
Yeah.
And we don't always do that.
Anybody else?
Yeah, the Lord told me to go on a retreat, but I had to stop everything. And then also went with my mother too, But it was like, man, but I felt like the Lord was showing me your identity is not in your ministry or what you do, but who you are with me. Because I feel like, oh my gosh, if I stop, then other things will stop, And I'm just reminded of this one time I was praying for someone. It was late at night, and I was starting to pray, and then I slept. And then I woke up like 40 minutes later, and the guy was saying, "Thank you, Lord, for healing me." And I thought, oh my gosh, God didn't heal me. I feel like God's saying, you're not God. I'm God, and rest in me. Have your identity, not what you do for me, but who are you're with me. And I think that's so important. It's about relationship rather than our work and performing. I don't know.
Yeah, so that's good. So we've talked a lot about like the Lord teaching us to rely on His provision, and part of that is learning that it's not like we do have personal responsibility, but everything's not hanging on me.
Yeah.
Like He is God. He's the one who provides. And even if I don't work the land in the year that He commands me to, I'm not going to get it. Or even if I rest because He says rest, like the world doesn't stop turning because of my actions. Yeah. Anyone else? We're talking about the personal application of Shabbat and Jubilee year.
I just have to add the concern of the balance of wisdom and discernment. We want to not accidentally give the children's bread to someone who is a scam artist. And there is a lot of that right now. And people manipulating people, knowing a little bit of what our hearts are, but then trying to take advantage. And so we do want to pray for wisdom and discernment.
Absolutely. And I think when we ask the question, who's my brother, who's my neighbor, that comes into play. Like I used to work at a ministry where people would come off the street that I didn't even know and then say, how come you're not going to give me a place to stay and food right now? And I would think like, that's a lot of like entitlement there that like I've never met you before. I don't even know if you're a believer. Like you're not even asking me, you're just demanding and thinking that I have to, right? And so I think that goes back to that question of who's my neighbor, who's my brother, and how do I give? And I think those are individual questions we have to ask the Lord and use discernment about, like, is this someone who genuinely needs help or that I'm supposed to show mercy to or not? Absolutely.
Well, I think this is along with that, along
Yeah.
those lines. I think sometimes we need. This has been true of me at times, and I think going along with what we're talking about with wisdom and discernment here, I think sometimes we have to like stop and think about does it really mean to help someone. It actually is rarely, or a very small part of it is actually giving them something. I remember I did an internship with a nonprofit that served people in poverty in different countries to try to help them get out of it, and it was not, they didn't give them anything. And during that internship, we read a book that talked about
Was it
different
when
parts
helping
of-
hurts?
yeah.
Yeah.
Different parts of missions and things like that. And it was, I remember one of the things that like has stuck with me, and it's probably 15 years ago that I read that book. I haven't read it since, but what has stuck with me is like, even the example they gave in that book of like when a natural disaster hits, like, yes, hurricane, tornado, like things destroy everything. Yes, you go in and you give them all the things, you're trying to just, it's that immediate response, but actually the window of time when you do that is very short. And then you start providing resources to help them rebuild and things like that. And so I think sometimes we have to think about how, like, what is actually helping. And along with that, I think the interesting shift and what we, like, as believers, I think something that we really need to think about is, like, in this context, in the Torah, and then even in Acts where we're seeing, the believers that were filled with the Holy Spirit serving and selling property and providing for each other, and that no one was living in poverty in that situation, and all those in Acts 4. They're really living out Torah at that point. But I think that too is like they weren't living in a society that has governmental social programs. So I think many of us have, like, we live in a culture where it's like, well, there's social services for this, which I'm not saying is categorically a bad thing, but it brings this tension, right, of like, how are we really helping people, and how, as believers, we're called to serve our brother, like you're saying, and it goes back to this question of who is our brother and who are we responsible for helping, which is something that we all need to wrestle with seriously. But it's also like it's hard to find that balance of like, when are some of those programs really helpful and when are they perpetuating poverty and things like that, because these are often roles that the body of Messiah were really called to fill.
And here's the thing that I thought of while you're saying that, which I think is part of the answer to that, is like when we're talking about bringing your brother into your household, like especially if they have been unwise and that's why they don't have any resources right now, they're not just in your household to get food and a place to sleep.
Right.
They're going to be affected by what's going on in your household, by the spiritual life of your household, by the discipline and habits they see in your household. And so that's a totally different reality than giving someone a handout.
Right.
Like taking them into your smaller community and having them do life with you should affect their life in a really substantial way.
And it also requires something of them, because that's the other part of this is like the person who's receiving the loan or the food or whatever, it doesn't, like, something is still required of them. Like if you're going to bring someone into your home, then it's fair to be like, well, this is how our home functions, and these are your responsibilities while you're here with us.
Yeah.
These are the rhythms that you're expected to be at dinner every night, or your chore on this week's chore list is to do this. So, like there's something required.
Absolutely.
Which as human, like it's in us to want to work and to provide and to be part of a family situation in some sense. Like it's part of how we were designed to be.
And like to me, if I bring you into my household, then you're part of my family and I'm gonna like love you.
Yeah.
I'm not just giving you money. Like that the relationship should affect your life.
For sure.
Any other thoughts? And then Kenny.
Yeah, just one thing that comes to mind is a lot in Proverbs about like he who doesn't plow his fields and he's gonna be in want.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Acts of writings, he who is not willing to work should not eat. So there is that balance of discerning a true need, and then of course we are to help, but you don't want to create dependence on the state, on you, for those who aren't really walking in their full potential that the Lord created them to walk in, which involves work.
Absolutely. Any
I can't hear. I'm gonna try the other Bible study. I
Okay.
can't hear anything.
Okay, I'm so sorry.
All right. Thank you.
Kenny?
So the question, who is your brother,
Yes.
right? So where do we seek wisdom on this? I've heard people say, well, all humanity is your brother, right? We're going to take back the common ancestry. We're going to take the common ancestry approach. well, everybody comes from Adam and Eve, right? So therefore, all humanity is your brother. Is that actually the essence of what it is that the Torah and the New Covenant are teaching us in regards to this? So that's a big question. If we're saying that all humanity is your brother, and I my own opinion is I personally don't agree with that. Right?
I don't think most interpretations of the Torah say that.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but again, the sort of a Christian worldview can be like, oh, well, all humanity is your brother, right? And then you can use the Good Samaritan and various some of the parables and then other things to sort of reinforce that argument. But does it fully hold water? Then I ask myself the question, well, if all humanity is your brother, and this is how we're supposed to treat people, when Israel was sent into the land and they were told to drive everybody out or kill them all,
And that's a problem.
well, is that your brother?
Yeah.
Then that I'm driving him out of his house and sending him off into the wilderness to start over again and or maybe die, or plain old and war wipe him out. And then, so this is really complicated, but it does have very important applications for when you add, well, how where we're supposed to use wisdom, or there isn't any, at least nothing that I've been able to come up with as far as a clear, definitive, black and white that encompasses the whole thing. I do think the believer, via the miraculous blood transfusion that we all get when everybody ends up coming into the kingdom or whatever, is a lot closer to your brother than like my actual brother who wasn't here a few minutes ago, but nonetheless. So all of this, I feel, is it to be taken with naivety, like, and just a blanket statement, coverall statement for the whole thing,
Yeah.
to say, oh, well, this is how you're supposed to be with everybody all the time, and
I don't think there's any interpretation that says that. And I think also, like, we want to take scripture as a whole. Like, Proverbs says, better a neighbor nearby than a brother in the day of disaster, a brother far away in the day of disaster. And so that we have some sense of, like, people that are close physically as well as people that are close familially, like, just what I said before of the Torah concept of, like, starting at home, basically. That's not the phrase I used, but and then moving outwards with those closest to us. So, like, I feel like I would have a closer obligation to my immediate family. Like, my mom is elderly. I go and see her every month, which is why I miss a lot. But I have told her, if you need someone to come take care of you, like, I will temporarily move to Florida and come take care of you. And I feel like that's important. And if my next door neighbor, who, like, literally our townhouse doors are right next to each other, and she is a believer, if she needed help, like when she fell and broke both her arms rock climbing, like, I would go sit with her. I would go buy her groceries, like, because she is nearby and she is a believer and a friend and needed support. And then I think sometimes the farther we get away from the nucleus, from the center of the issue, is where then we're like, where are the boundaries? Where are the borders? And we have to use more discernment and wisdom and ask the Lord, because the resources are His, right? This is not my money in my pocket to decide who I want to give it to. It really ultimately belongs to the Lord, and I'm a steward of it. And so I need to ask Him where I should use it and how I should use it wisely. Am I actually doing damage to this person in the way that I'm supporting them, or am I bringing them closer in relationship to me and closer in relationship to the Lord, and that's going to actually help them and bless them? Yeah.
Matthew 12:48, Yeshua says, like, whoever does the will of my Father is his brother, his mother, his sister. So I think the question is, how do you tell if someone's doing the will of God as well?
Yeah.
Which is another kind of battle of discernment as well.
Absolutely. I think it's gotten harder in our current day and age. Like, if we're extrapolating, okay, my brother is a believer in Yeshua, especially someone I don't know, like, there are lots of people who say, like, oh, I'm a Christian, or I'm this or that, but, like, what does that mean to them? Are they really, are they, Nola brought up, are they just trying to scam me? Or, I think that's an argument towards like we have more obligation to someone that we're in relationship with who we know is a believer.
Yeah.
And then back there, sorry.
I feel like me as a Gentile believer, God's called me to provoke the Jews to jealousy. And it could be very costly. Jesus said, when you do unto the least of my brethren, you do unto me. And so it's not just who is my brother, but what kind of brother am I to the Jewish people? And in the context of, I think, end times, it could be very costly. To shelter a Jewish person in the persecution. Corrie ten Boom, Bonhoeffer. I think God said you were brothers, sisters to my brother. And so, I just feel like I as a Gentile believer, I have a call to be partnering like Ruth to Naomi, but especially bringing people that are orphaned, whether Jew or Gentile, to the kinsman redeemer. Because he's the ultimate help, not me, but we're called to bring them to the ultimate redeemer. So that's
And I think there's a bigger conversation about like it is costly to love people. I was having a conversation with someone who was like, well, I know you are just used to like being a missionary and opening your home and having people, but I don't like to do that. And I eventually said jokingly, like, because I have a lot of relationship with this person, like, well, you can be like that, but that's not biblical. And like it was not like snappy and mean. She laughed, but like it is, and like she was just saying, I don't like to do that. I like to have my house the way I like to have it. I don't like to be disrupted by other people. And I was saying, like, do you think I like that? Like, it's costly. Like, the last time when someone was at my house, they like broke something and ruined something else, and somebody once left the water running for like a day because there were all these people here visiting, and they were like sleeping in a situation where there weren't good showers, and the showers broke. So I told the guys, like, okay, between these hours you can come over and use my shower, and the last one left it running took me a day to figure out. Like, it's costly. There was a real water bill that came with that. It is costly to love people well. And like we don't do it because it doesn't cost anything. We actually do it more so. Like, that's an offering to the Lord. Kenny brought up, like, we're giving to the Lord when we give to people who are poor. We're giving to the Lord when we're generous with his people. And that's an important part of this. I don't think we're supposed to do it without counting the cost. I think we're supposed to say, no, like, this is costly and the Lord's worthy of it, and so are his people that belong to him. Was someone back there had their hand up?
Oh, I have testimony like in my working place. There's the coworker talk about she has this neighbor's elder is unable to throw away the trash. That's why the trash over the yard even, and she's her upset. And I heard about this. I said, oh, I can come over to help him, right? Love neighborhood. And the other coworker said, yeah, I want to go too. Let's go together. And then we team up with 3. We went to there, have this elder clean up all the whole house like trash, and then we're planning to go regularly to help him. His family cannot, I think, around here, but some family don't really connect that much, and then we just feel like, oh, we're so glad we did our best. Love your neighbors,
Yeah. And I think, I was talking to somebody about how love changes everything. Like, we're called to like love one another, right? And one of my closest friends to this day lived with me. That's actually how we met each other. We talked on the phone for 2 hours. I sent her pictures of my house. She rented a room for me for a year, and we became like closest friends. And other people before that, when they had rented a room from me, I would be like, oh my gosh, didn't clean the dishes right. But I love Madeline so much that like I would open the clean dishwasher and she put a plate with jelly in it and it's all over everything. I was like, oh, Madeline. And I would just clean the dishes. Like, there was no need to like go back to her and be like, really, you made all the dishes dirty, can you clean it up? Because I loved her. Like, it made a difference in the way I approached that situation. And I think when we're really carrying out the Torah and the commandments and loving God and loving others, it allows us to do this well. So, Any other thoughts? I'm not actually sure what time we're supposed to end. Is it
Around
9:45 or
9:45,
9:30
yeah.
or
9:45.
Okay, so we have like 5 more minutes if there's any thoughts, or we can just end a little bit early.
Well, I was just noticing, like, in what you're saying about kind of when you were kind of bringing it together, like, how do we kind of know who is our brother, who we're called to help, and things like that. The relationship aspect comes out.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to mean that it's the person that you like the most.
No, absolutely not.
But relationship does matter. Like you're
Yes.
saying, like, it's a way different thing to see, like, be driving down the street and see someone and invite them to your house versus someone who's been in your community who's just having a really hard time and needs, some help for a little bit or something. Like, that's way different. We're not necessarily talking about inviting the person off the street into your home.
Yeah.
The relationship does matter because you don't know a lot of the factors with that. And again, we want to actually help people and not hurt them.
Yeah.
And so the relational aspect of that helps a lot.
Yeah, and I think I already said this, but I honestly can't remember. Like, when someone comes into my house, like, not like we talk about them being affected by like the routines and the way, but like us really loving them.
Yeah.
I think makes a really big difference too.
For sure.
And sometimes it's not because we love them, but we just ask the Lord to like help us love them, because some people are easier to love than others sometimes.
Yeah.
Have you seen the movie The Hiding Place?
I haven't seen the movie. I've read the book.
Oh, okay. But just
The book's
I think-
always better.
Oh,
No,
okay.
just kidding. I'm just kidding.
For Corey Ten Boom, she had to host a very difficult person.
Mhm.
But anyhow, I think if we look at it as God's trying to grow me in love,
Mhm. Yeah.
and humility,
Yeah.
it might,
For
yeah.
sure.
So this part in our portion, in 25, chapter 25, 44 through 46, where it talks about having slaves.
Yes.
And so, like, as we had all this discussion here, I'm thinking, well, okay, so there really is kind of a different way that you treat people. You know what I mean? Not, you love everyone, but because he's basically saying you can have slaves.
Mhm.
He does, it seems that you are to treat them right.
Yes.
You can have slaves, but you're not, like the very last statement where it says you're not to rule, but over your brothers you must not rule over one another with harshness.
Mhm.
So when I read that, I went, oh, so I can treat those from the nation with harshness?
I don't know. That's like the same thing as when it says like don't
I know,
charge
I know.
interest on food. I don't think that's the implication.
Right.
Yeah.
But I'm saying, so
There is a distinction.
Yeah, there is. In
Yes.
this portion, it kind of goes along with what we're just saying.
Yeah.
There is a little bit of a distinction.
And I would bring in, like, I think it's good for us to think of when it says slave to think of as, like, servant, because it's, like, especially our cultural understanding of, like, chattel slavery, that's not what this is talking about. But also, I would say that of any place in the world, in the ancient world, to be a slave, I would assume that Israel was, to live with the Israelites would have been the best possible place where you would be treated the best.
Because also remember in the ancient world, like, and this is even looking forward to when they go into the land, there's a lot of people living there.
Mm-hmm.
I always kind of jokingly say, like, it would have been a lot easier if God would have just built a fence around Israel and kept it empty until they were able to come in and they didn't have to deal with all the people, but that doesn't work. But there's all these people there. And the Lord does talk about driving them out, but there's also in the ancient world, the practice is if you conquer another group of people, you're probably going to take some of them as slaves, which is not the same, like Amanda's saying, as like what we think of in this country as like the African slave trade, which was not what the Bible is talking about at all.
Right.
And so it's like, because really when you conquer people, how I understand this based on how they're to treat these people, like this should actually be the best option. If your land is being conquered, your options are death, wandering in the wilderness by yourself, or becoming a servant to Israel, and they're to be treated fairly. So that's probably going to be a better situation than your other options. That's actually what's supposed to be happening, is that there's supposed to be this higher moral standard here. And we have our modern brains have a really hard time with that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
this is part of the world's the world's reality at the time when this is written. And so basically it's another point where God is saying, this is what's going to happen. You may not act like other nations when this happens. You must do better. You must treat people as people.
Yeah.
Always.
It's funny that you say that it would have been easier without all those other people there, because most of my adult life I've worked in like very different contexts of ministry, and like my running line is always, this would be so easy if it weren't for the people.
Right?
Like, so, well, on that note, it's 9:45 and we'll end Torah study. Have a good morning. Shabbat Shalom.